Okay, well, next up we've got Robb Robinson. So we're going to hear a little bit about the Viola, or Diaz, which some of you will have spotted in John's presentation. So Rob, if you're ready and happy to share your screen and take over, the floor is yours.
I'm very much indeed ready to take over. That was excellent. Really enjoyed that. What I'm going to look at is going beyond Great Vic and beyond South Georgia in many respects, because I'm going to look at the story of the Viola and try to explain why it's so interesting and why it is such a unique vessel. I'm going to look at several different areas. I'm going to try to cover the background. Why do we have an interest in this particular ship? And then look a bit of its career and what it did throughout the 20th century. And then finally, you know, where are we trying to go with this vessel? What are we trying to do with it? So let's get stuck in, really. I'm a maritime historian. I work at the University of Hull, or I did. I'm now an honorary research fellow. I'm retired. And I really got quite an interest in the vessel from the late 1990s. We were embarking on a nationwide study of the English fisheries for Conway Maritime Press, and Conway like a lot of images, and they wanted something a bit unusual. I mentioned about the Viola, about the fact this vessel lay at South Georgia, that it was probably the oldest surviving steam trawler in the world, and I could probably get a couple of images of it. They asked me to write a piece upon it, and when I started writing up the stuff on the Viola, I realized just how important a ship we were dealing with, and how it was such an important segment of the UK and indeed the world maritime history. Not only that, when I started doing some work on the background to it, I dug out the early crew lists from the vessel's early days, and I noticed my great-grandfather had sailed on it as mate, which was incredibly surprising back in 1907. And that, of course, gives you quite an interest. So over a period of time, we put together the story of the ship, working with various people, interrogating early records in various sources, people actually who remembered this type of vessel working. We put together the story and published an article on it in the Mariner's Mirror. Not long after that, I was approached by several individuals with an interest in South Georgia. It would be about 2003, 2004 by then, who had concerns about the vessel. The problem was, of course, that like the other vessels down there, they'd been left since the whaling station had been abandoned in the 60s and had gradually deteriorated. And there'd been an attempt to clean out the bunkers on the vessels in about 2003, which had only been partly successful. The result of that was that a year later, it was decided to do some more substantive work on the vessel, which involved lifting them. And that was the issue, because once they were lifted, what were they going to do with them once they were refloated? And there were suggestions put forward that they might be taken out to sea and sunk. And this was a concern to certain people. It was certainly a concern to myself and one or two other people. And as a result of that, I got in touch with quite a lot of maritime historians across the world. And we all lobbied the government of South Georgia. To be fair, I think the idea of taking the vessel out and sinking it and the others was a bit of a secondary subject, but nevertheless, our work helped reinforce the fact that these vessels were particularly important, and none more so than the Viola. On the back of that, we began to look at the long-term issues to do with it. The Viola in 2004, as the Diaz, was refloated and again secured in the beach in the way that it is now. But in essence, that's a sort of medium time fix for the vessel. It will continue to deteriorate, as will the others, unless substantive work or something's done with them. And we gradually, with the help of people like Tony Ellerbeck, who's had a lot to do, of course, with the South Georgia Association, looked at the idea of bringing the vessel back. But it was going to be quite a difficult job, and I'll come back to that later on. But certainly this led us to examine and study the vessel and the people who work with the vessel in all its different contexts. And what we uncovered really was a story of the sort of a maritime history of the long Atlantic during the 20th century. And I'm going to just pick out some of the key elements of the Viola story from that. The vessel itself was built in 1906. It was constructed at Beverley. If you look on a map of the East Riding of Yorkshire, you'll see that Beverley's way inland. But in actual fact, it's situated on the River Hull and was one of the major places for building steam trawlers and their successors right through until the 1960s. This vessel was built there. It was built for a firm called the Helier Steam Trawling Company, and it was going to be used for in what they call the North Sea boxing fleets. Charles Helier, who ran the company, basically was a trawling tycoon, probably the first of his kind, and he'd envisaged the building of a fleet of 50 vessels to go out and fish in the North Sea, and that indeed is what he embarked upon and what he actually constructed. He was also a bit of a Shakespearean nut. Everything he had around him, he named after Shakespearean characters. Even his son was called Orlando, and he named all his vessels after different characters from Shakespeare. Hence, the Viola got its name. The vessel sailed in early March 1906. It joined the first sailing of the North Sea boxing fleet, and incredibly, the fleet that sailed out into the North Sea in March 1906 remained at sea until August 1914. I might say that's totally impossible. Vessels can't stay out for that long. Well, they didn't. The fleet was always on the grounds, and as a couple of vessels sort of ran low on fuel and the crews needed relief, they would sail back to port, and other vessels would come out and replace them. As a result of that, there was a constant presence by the fleet on the grounds for that period of time. Their fish was packed in boxes and then transferred by open boat, winter or summer, to fast steam cutters, which ran it into Billingsgate in London to unload. These were called the North Sea boxing fleets. It was a particularly perilous job, and this was the role that my great-grandfather, by the way, had played at the time. The vessel continued in that role through until the Great War. It would probably have continued for a long time afterwards, but of course, in August 1914, the Great War was declared. The fleets were immediately called back from the North Sea, and within weeks, the Viola had a new job altogether. It had been recruited by the Admiralty. And of course, when we think about the Great War at sea, what we tend to think about is we tend to hear about dreadnoughts and Jutland and that sort of emphasis. But much of the day-to-day work off the coasts of Britain was actually fought by fishermen and fishing vessels. Indeed, if we were to drain the North Sea, if we were able to drain the North Sea and look at the shore, we would see a battleground that stretched all the way from not far from the coast of Flanders, not far from where the Western Front is on land, all the way up to Scotland, in what we call the East Coast War Channels. These were specially swept channels that vessels were allowed to sail up and down. And the job of the Viola and several vessels like it were to keep these channels clear. Some of the vessels were involved in minesweeping, others were engaged with the U-boats. And it was the U-boat dimension that the Viola was taken up into service for. She had a crew of fishermen. She was armed initially with just a 3-pounder gun and what was called an explosive sweep, which was towed behind the vessel. And if it came in contact with the U-boat, then it was expected to be exploded. It was very primitive and very simple. And it spent the first 2 years of its life, of its wartime life, patrolling from Lerwick and patrolling between Muckleflugger to the north of the Shetland, down as far as Fair Isle. It had 1 or 2 encounters with U-boats. The vessel, like the others that were working with it, were particularly equipped, able to do much with the U-boats at that time. While it was on those duties, and it did a lot of work there, 2 members of the crew, 2 of the fishermen who were attached to the vessel at different times, died. I'm not going to go into the story of why they died down, but basically they died as a result of being on military service. In 1916, by that time the vessel was armed with a 6-pounder gun, later a 12-pounder gun. The vessel and the immediate other flotilla of vessels that it worked with were transferred down to the Tyne, and their job was to patrol between the Scottish border and Whitby in North Yorkshire. And it was during that last 2 years of the war that the vessel encountered, or rather had many encounters with U-boats, armed encounters, which led to the exchange of shots in both directions. The skipper of the vessel on one occasion was mentioned in dispatches for driving off a U-boat which had been attacking a Norwegian merchant vessel. It was quite a period of time. Indeed, it's worth reflecting that our vessel had been built in 1906, and within a few weeks of the vessel having been built, by the way, HMS Dreadnought had been launched to much greater acclaim. And not long afterwards, the Germans had built their first U-boat, the U-1. If we move forward to the Great War, which vessel was involved in sinking the most enemy vessels? Well, it wasn't the U-1 and it wasn't the Dreadnought. It was actually the Viola. And the Viola, in its encounters, was involved in the sinking in the last year of the war of 2 U-boats. By that time, it had been fitted with hydrophones, which were a new device, electronic listening device, and it was also fitted with depth charges. The crew were quite a formidable fighting machine. And during the course of the war, by the way, it's worth reflecting that this vessel was at sea week after week, month after month throughout the war, and undoubtedly sailed far more miles in the sort of on the maritime front line than any of the dreadnoughts did. It was involved in the sinking, as I say, of the UB-30 in August 1918. One of the other vessels that it was involved with there was an armed yacht that also took on. That vessel later moved on to become become a Trinity House tender vessel after the war. But in the last sort of weeks or months of the war, it was also involved in the sinking of the UB-115. UB-115 was sunk not only by a couple of destroyers and several of these armed trawlers, but also with the aid of an airship, the R-29. It was the first occasion that an airship had been involved in the sinking of a U-boat. And it was a first that was to be repeated in a different way in the context of the Viola story later on. The war ended in 1918, of course. The vessel was demobilized in 1919. A few months later, or a little bit later, it was sold on to the Norwegians. It was used initially for trawling off the coast of Norway, but trawling was not a popular activity in Norway. And later, it was purchased by a company run by Niels Forsen Alonso, and it was converted to go whaling. It's unusual for a trawler to be made into a whale capture vessel because of the lack of speed, but it was used for hunting humpback whales off the coast of Africa. Did this for a few seasons. There wasn't much profit made, and in the mid-1920s it was laid up at Sandfjord in Norway, which had become its base. A couple of years later, or within a couple of years, it was purchased by company Argentina de Pesca. Pesca, of course, as it's well known, and it was sent to South Georgia, where, of course, it was used for catching elephant seals. As many people who are listening to this will know, elephant seal hunting was quite strongly regulated at that time by the Falkland Islands government. There were only certain periods of time during the season when elephant seals could be hunted. The island was divided into 4 quarters. Only 3 quarters could be hunted in any one year, and only the large adult males were taken. The vessel did this work right through from the late 1920s through, of course, to the 1960s. But because it wasn't involved for the full, if you like, let's call it South Georgia season, it got used for charter work. And it was involved in a whole range of expeditions, from the Cole Larsen expedition in the late 1920s, right through to the Bird Island expedition in the early 1960s. And my colleague Ian Hart reckons it was probably involved in some degree of southern exploration longer than any other particular vessel in its story. It was also employed to relieve the Argentinian weather station at Laurie Island on one occasion when the Argentinian Navy had been unable to get through. So the vessel had a long life down in that area. It retained its steam engines, its triple expansion steam engines, in the 1960s. These were 1950s. They were converted to burn oil. But other than that, and the shift in the position of the bridge on the vessel, the basic structure of the vessel remained the same. And of course, sealing continued until the Grytviken whaling station closed in the early 1960s, when the vessel itself was mothballed, maintained for a number of years by the one individual who remained down there, and in case the industry restarted, the sealing restarted. Of course, it never did. The vessel eventually, with the accompanying seal vessels around it, sank to the bottom at its moorings, and that would have probably been largely the end of the story, of course, had it not been for the Argentinian invasion. And of course, if we remember, the spark that lit the conflagration was, of course, the landing of the scrap metal merchants on at South Georgia. And of course, one of the early things they were due to cut up were these three vessels that lie at Grytviken. But of course, they ran up the Argentinian flag instead, and the rest is history. It's interesting to think that in the retaking of the island, which was fought to some degree in relatively close proximity to the Viola, we saw the disablement of the Argentinian submarine Santa Fe by helicopters. This was the first, of course, occasion that helicopters had been involved in disabling a submarine, another aerial first. It's interesting to reflect to the fact that the Viola itself had been involved in an early aerial first with an airship. The vessel, of course, remained for a long period of time where it was gradually deteriorating, but of course this led to the need eventually to do some work on the vessel, and that, of course, is where we became involved. And of course, as a result of those early inquiries about what we could do with the vessel, we gradually formulated a plan about recovering the vessel and bringing it back. Because, of course, the situation that exists down there is a medium-term situation. Yes, the vessel was stabilized. Yes, the tanks were cleaned out, but the deterioration will continue. And what we have here is a particularly incredibly rare artifact. It's one of only 4 surviving vessels, for example, from the Great War, and that's just one of its stories. And of course, this vessel actually saw probably more action than the other 3 combined. So it's quite a remarkable vessel from a whole host of contexts. Problem for us, of course, was, okay, yeah, we need to recover the vessel. What are the logistics for doing that? And if we did recover it, what permission, how would we get permission to acquire the vessel or to bring it, to remove it? And at the other end, what were we going to do with it? Well, I'm not going to go through the full story of that. You can look on our Viola Trust website. But in later years, we've recruited a formidable team of people to support our work and what we're trying to do with the Viola. And we've conducted technical surveys. We know it's possible or we're confident it's possible to raise the vessel and to remove it and return it. At the other end, in the city of Hull, which of course is where the vessel comes from, we have a place to place it. Hull's very much involved in a new maritime project called Yorkshire's Maritime City, which involves the use of 2 dry docks, one of which will house the Arctic Corsair, which is one of Hull's last sidewinder trawlers. And the other dock has been earmarked for the Viola. And the story of the Viola is quite dramatic, but it's about more than fishing, if you think about it. What having the Viola back in Britain will do is provide us with a vehicle by which we can tell all sorts of different maritime stories. And of course, not least the story of South Georgia and the South Atlantic. And that also has an important element in terms of Hull. Hull's been involved in all sorts of aspects of South Georgia and indeed polar history at both ends, you know, as I say, the polar history at both ends of the world. But if I just concentrate very briefly on South Georgia and the area, let's just think about a couple of aspects. South Georgia, of course, was discovered by the Resolution. Everybody knows that the Resolution was built in Whitby, but it was actually had been a Hull ship. It had been built for a man called William Hammond, who eventually sold it to the Admiralty, and of course it was used for Cook's Voyage. Let's move much later. The Royal Research ship William Scoresby, which played such an important role, was built in the same shipyard as the Viola and used the same engines, for example. And of course, if we go to the Falklands War, then the port that supplied most vessels, civilian vessels, to the Falklands War was Hull. It was a long engagement, and that's been brought home to me very closely in our involvement with this vessel, because all sorts of people from across the city and wider afield have come forward to share their recollections of the vessel and where we could go with it and what we could do. And we want to use it to be able to tell a whole host of stories. We want to use it to tell the Ellie fisheries history quite clearly, but we also want to use it to tell the story of its role in the Great War, a forgotten role of an island nation, very much up against it. And finally, we want to be able to tell the story or use it as a vehicle to be able to illustrate and tell much more about the South Atlantic and South Georgia in particular. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of that. You can read much more about the story if you don't know it on our Viola website, which is available, quite easy to find. Without going through the URL, just go Google Viola Trawler Net and you'll come up with it. Or you can have a read of our book Viola, which tells something of this remarkable story. What I would just finish by saying is the Viola story is really quite unique. It's very much a story of the long Atlantic and the 20th century, and it encompasses a long period of time. But it's not just about the ship, it's about the people whose lives and livelihoods were tied up with that vessel in all sorts of different ways. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain a little bit about the ship today, and I hope you'll like our way forward. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. That was really interesting, and good to hear a little bit about a vessel that certainly I'm quite familiar with seeing in a not too good state in Grytviken. And yeah, it was fantastic. So are there any questions for Rob? Lots of positive feedback, Rob. I'm just trying to scroll through the see if there's any questions for you. But I think everyone can see a copy of the book over your right shoulder there. So
yeah. All there.
Exactly.
I would say it's worth a read, but it's written by myself and my colleague Ian Hart, and of course Ian was one of the original people involved with the museum at South Georgia at Grytviken, and I think you'll find a lot about South Georgia within the book itself.
I'm sure. I mean, I read the book a couple of years ago, but it's probably spurred me to have another look at it again, I think, in the next few days. So, well, thanks, Rob. I mean, I think there'll probably be some questions coming to you on the chat. So if you'd be, you have a look at the chat and keep an eye on that and answer any questions that come through there. We will move on to the next talk. Thank you very much, Rob.